You know, when the Galactic Council first decided to establish the Interspecies Military Academy, they probably thought they were being incredibly progressive. Look at us. They likely congratulated themselves over whatever passes for champagne in their respective biologies. Bringing together the greatest military minds from across the galaxy to share knowledge and tactics. What they definitely didn't expect was for Earth to show up. I mean, sure, humanity had recently joined the galactic community after what historians would politely call an unfortunate first contact incident involving orbital bombardment and a very stubborn species that refused to surrender. The Council figured humans might have some interesting perspectives on warfare, given that we'd managed to not only survive their pacification attempt, but actually win the subsequent conflict. What they didn't realize was that inviting humans to a military academy was like inviting a pyromaniac to a fireworks factory, and then acting surprised when things got explosive. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me set the scene properly. The Interspecies Military Academy sat on the neutral moon of Kepler 442c, a choice that seemed diplomatic until you realized it meant the commissary had to accommodate 17 different atmospheric requirements, and nobody could agree on what constituted food. The architecture was that special kind of utilitarian ugly that screamed designed by committee. All flowing curves and unnecessary spires that somehow managed to offend every aesthetic sensibility simultaneously. Captain Derek Steele stood at the back of Lecture Hall 7, trying not to laugh at the name they'd given him on his identification badge. Apparently, the Galactic Council's translation software had some creative interpretations of human surnames. He'd decided not to correct them, mostly because watching aliens struggle to pronounce steel with various numbers of tongues, vocal cords, and breathing apparatus was endlessly entertaining. "Today," announced General Thexazoth of the hegemony of Zarthal, his forearms gesturing dramatically while his chitinous exoskeleton gleamed under the lecture hall's bioluminescent lighting. "We shall discuss the fundamental principles of modern warfare as established by the greatest military minds in galactic history." Derek glanced around the lecture hall. The student body was impressively diverse, if you defined diverse as a collection of species that all seemed to have missed the same memo about effective military strategy. There were the crystalline Veltar, who approached warfare with the methodical precision of chess masters playing a game where all the pieces moved in slow motion. The gas giant-dwelling Nefari floated in their environmental suits, their tentacles twitching with what Derek had learned to recognize as their version of taking notes. And then there were the Zithrak, proud descendants of a warrior culture that had apparently forgotten that warrior culture was supposed to involve actually winning wars. At the front of the room, General Thexazoth was warming up to his favorite subject. "The first principle of civilized warfare," he declared, his voice carrying that particular tone of someone who'd never had to clean blood out of their equipment, "is the establishment of clear battle lines, order, discipline, formation fighting. These are the hallmarks of proper military engagement." Derek felt his eyebrow twitch. He'd been specifically instructed by his superiors to observe and learn, and try not to cause an interstellar incident this time. The last part stung a bit, mostly because the incident with the Corvan ambassador's ceremonial headdress had been a complete accident. How was he supposed to know that commenting on its resemblance to a military target would be considered an insult worthy of a formal diplomatic protest? "The second principle," the general continued, apparently just getting started, "is the importance of honor in combat. A warrior's reputation is built upon their adherence to the established rules of engagement. Surprise attacks, guerrilla tactics, and unconventional warfare are the tools of the weak and cowardly." That did it. Derek's other eyebrow joined the first in what his old drill sergeant would have called the expression of a man about to do something that'll get him court-martialed. Near the front of the lecture hall, Staff Sergeant Riley Martinez, whose name badge read Staff Sergeant Angry Mountain, thanks to the translation software's continued artistic liberties, slowly raised her hand. General Thexazoth paused mid-gesture, all four eyes focusing on the human female with what Derek recognized as the expression of a professor who'd just been asked to explain something he'd never actually thought about. "Yes, human?" "Just a quick question, sir," Riley said, her voice carrying that deceptively polite tone that every experienced soldier learned to fear. "When you say rules of engagement and honor in combat, are you referring to the same rules that led to the Zarthul hegemony losing their last 14 military conflicts in a row?" The lecture hall went dead silent. Even the Nefari stopped their constant low-frequency humming, which Derek hadn't even realized was possible. General Thexazoth's exoskeleton made a sound like grinding metal, The hegemony's recent setbacks were due to facing enemies who refused to engage in proper civilized warfare. Ah, Riley nodded sagely. So your enemies were using unconventional tactics, the same tactics you just described as being for the weak and cowardly. That is not. The general's chitinous plates shifted in what Derek had learned was the Zarthul equivalent of a nervous stutter. Because it seems to me, Riley continued, apparently just getting started, that if your civilized warfare keeps getting you beaten by weak and cowardly tactics, maybe the problem isn't with your enemy's honor. Maybe the problem is with your strategy. Derek buried his face in his hands. So much for not causing an incident. What happened next was what military historians would later call the 37 minutes that changed galactic warfare forever. Though at the time it felt more like the 37 minutes that were going to get every human in the Academy expelled and possibly airlocked. General Thexazoth, to his credit, didn't immediately call security. Instead, he drew himself up to his full impressive height, which was still about 6 inches shorter than Riley, but who's counting, and fixed her with what was probably meant to be an intimidating stare. You question the military wisdom of civilizations that have been waging war for millennia before your species even discovered fire? Riley shrugged. I'm questioning the military wisdom of civilizations that have been losing wars for millennia despite having every possible advantage. A ripple of what Derek recognized as suppressed alien laughter ran through the lecture hall. The Veltar's crystalline bodies were chiming in their version of amusement, while several of the Nephori had turned interesting shades of blue. Every possible advantage? The general's voice rose an octave. Sure, Riley said, settling back in her chair with the air of someone who'd found her groove. You've got faster-than-light travel, energy weapons, shields, artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, genetic engineering, and centuries of technological advancement. Yet somehow, a bunch of primitive humans with chemical propellant weapons and bad attitudes managed to fight off your pacification attempt and win a war against a coalition of 7 galactic powers. That was a fluke. Was it? Riley asked innocently. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you guys have been so focused on playing war, like it's some kind of elaborate dance, that you forgot it's actually supposed to be about winning. Derek watched General Thexazoth's forearms start to twitch, and decided it might be time to intervene before Riley talked them into their own execution. But before he could move, one of the Veltar students spoke up. Elaborate dance? The crystal being's voice resonated like wind chimes in a thunderstorm. Oh, absolutely, Riley said, clearly warming to her theme. Look at what the general just described as proper warfare. Clear battle lines, formal rules of engagement, honor codes that prevent you from actually trying to win efficiently. It's like you're all playing a game where the objective isn't to defeat your enemy. It's to defeat your enemy while adhering to a set of arbitrary rules that make victory as difficult as possible. A Zithrak student, whose warrior culture had allegedly never met a challenge they couldn't turn into an honor duel, leaned forward. And humans do not follow these rules? Riley's grin was the kind that made drill sergeants nervous and enemy generals update their wills. Human military doctrine has exactly one rule. Win. Everything else is just details. But surely, General Thexazoth interjected, his voice now carrying a note of desperation. Surely you cannot advocate for complete abandonment of military honor and tradition. I'm not advocating for abandoning honor, Riley replied. I think honor is great. I just think dead honorable soldiers are a lot less useful than living soldiers who know how to adapt. She stood up, and Derek noticed that every alien in the room was suddenly paying very close attention. Humans, he reflected, had a talent for commanding attention, usually right before things went spectacularly wrong. Let me tell you about the Battle of Proxima Station, Riley said, beginning to pace in the small space in front of her chair. 3 months into the war, a human defense force of 200 Marines was tasked with holding a mining station against a Corvan assault fleet. The Corvans showed up with 1,200 warriors, full orbital support, and energy weapons that could melt through our best armor like it was made of paper. The lecture hall was dead silent now. Even the general had stopped his nervous chitinous plate shifting. According to galactic military doctrine, Riley continued, the humans should have formed defensive lines, established clear fields of fire, and prepared for an honorable last stand that would be remembered in songs and tactical analysis for generations to come. That is correct, General Thexazoth said slowly. Instead, Riley said with a grin that would have made a shark nervous. The human commander looked at the situation and said, well, this is dumb, and ordered his Marines to abandon the station. A collective gasp ran through the alien students. Even Derek, who'd heard this story before, had to admire Riley's delivery. The Corvins landed, secured the station, and began setting up their base of operations, confident that they'd won a glorious victory. They followed all the proper protocols, established perimeter defenses, and began sending regular status reports to their fleet. Riley paused for dramatic effect, a technique she'd clearly learned from the best. What they didn't know was that the humans hadn't actually left. They'd hidden in the maintenance tunnels, the air recycling systems, the cargo bays, and every other space the Corvins hadn't thought to check, because it wasn't part of their proper tactical doctrine. General Thexazoth's exoskeleton was making that grinding sound again. Surely you cannot mean— "Oh, I absolutely do," Riley said cheerfully. For the next 6 days, 200 humans turned that mining station into the galaxy's most educational haunted house. The Corvins would wake up to find their sentries missing. Their equipment would malfunction in ways that violated several laws of physics. Their communications would get jammed by someone playing what I'm told was truly terrible human music. One of the Nefari students was vibrating with what Derek had learned was their version of excitement. But that's not proper warfare." "No," Riley agreed. "It's effective warfare." By day 7, the Corvan commander was requesting immediate evacuation because his troops were convinced the station was haunted by the vengeful spirits of human warriors. The human commander sent a message offering to perform an exorcism in exchange for the Corvins abandoning their claim to the entire system. "And?" pressed a Veltar student. "The Corvins agreed," Riley said with obvious satisfaction. 200 humans, using tactics that would make every military academy in the galaxy clutch their pearls, successfully drove off 1,200 enemy warriors and secured an entire star system. The lecture hall erupted in a chaos of alien voices, all speaking at once in languages Derek didn't recognize, but in tones he absolutely did. That was the sound of people having their worldview fundamentally challenged, and it was either going to result in a breakthrough or a breakdown. General Thexazoth raised all 4 arms for silence. When the room finally quieted, he fixed Riley with a stare that could have melted hull plating. "Staff Sergeant Angry Mountain," he said, clearly struggling with the translation. "Are you suggesting that proper military education should teach students to hide in maintenance tunnels and play loud music?" Riley's expression shifted to something Derek recognized as her teaching mode. It was an expression that had struck fear into the hearts of new recruits across 3 star systems. "I'm suggesting that proper military education should teach students to think," she said simply. "Your tactical doctrine is so rigid that you can't adapt when someone doesn't follow the same rules you do. You're like fencers trying to fight someone with a crowbar. Your technique might be beautiful, but it's not going to help you when your opponent doesn't care about form." She gestured around the room. "How many of you have studied the human conflicts on Earth? The wars we fought before we got into space?" The silence was telling. "I thought so. Because if you had, you'd know that humans have been dealing with this exact problem for thousands of years. We've fought against enemies with better equipment, better training, better numbers, and better position. And we've won anyway, because we learned early that the universe doesn't care about your tactical doctrine. It only cares about results." Derek found himself nodding along despite his better judgment. Riley was getting into dangerous territory, the kind of dangerous territory that led to humans being asked to leave politely but firmly. But she wasn't wrong. General Thexazoth's chitinous plates were shifting restlessly now. "But without proper rules and structure, warfare becomes chaos." "No," Riley said with a shake of her head. "Warfare is chaos. Rules and structure are how we try to pretend it's not, but that doesn't change reality. The moment you step onto a battlefield, everything you planned goes out the airlock, and the only thing that matters is whether you can adapt faster than the other guy." She turned to address the room as a whole. "You want to know why humans keep winning fights we shouldn't win? It's not because we're stronger or smarter or better equipped. It's because when our plans fail, and they always fail, we don't stand around debating proper protocol. We improvise." A Zithrak student raised what Derek assumed was a hand, though it looked more like a clawed appendage that evolution had repurposed for violence. "But surely improvisation cannot be taught in a formal military setting." Riley's grin was back, and Derek felt a familiar sense of impending doom. "Actually," she said, "that's exactly what human military training is designed to do." What followed was less a lecture and more a masterclass in how to completely overturn everything you thought you knew about military science in under an hour. Riley had somehow managed to commandeer the front of the lecture hall, with General Thexazoth relegated to the role of increasingly bewildered observer. The alien students were hanging on her every word, occasionally interjecting with questions that revealed just how fundamentally different their approach to warfare had been. "Human basic training," Riley explained, pacing back and forth like a caged predator. Starts with the assumption that everything will go wrong. We don't train soldiers to follow perfect plans. We train them to function when the plans fall apart. A Veltar student chimed with curiosity. But surely there must be some foundational principles. Oh, absolutely, Riley said. Principle 1, survive. Principle 2, complete the mission. Principle 3, everything else is negotiable. Negotiable? General Thexazoth's voice cracked slightly. Negotiable, Riley confirmed. Your formation gets broken up by enemy fire? Adapt. Your equipment fails? Improvise. Your commanding officer gets taken out? Someone else takes command and keeps going. The mission parameters change mid-operation? You change with them. She turned to face the general directly. You teach your students to execute perfect plans. We teach our students to execute imperfect plans perfectly, and then to throw those plans away when they inevitably stop working. Derek watched the alien students processing this information with the kind of fascination usually reserved for traffic accidents and natural disasters. The Nefari were pulsing through color spectrums he'd never seen before, while the Zithrak were making sounds that their translators were diplomatically rendering as thoughtful warrior contemplation. But this approach must lead to tremendous casualties, protested a student Derek couldn't identify, some kind of mantis-like creature with too many joints in all the wrong places. Actually, no, Riley said, and Derek could practically see her mental gears shifting into statistics mode. Human military casualties, proportional to engagement size, are consistently lower than average galactic rates. Turns out that when your soldiers can think for themselves instead of waiting for orders, they're better at not dying. The Mantis Thing's translator managed to convey what Derek interpreted as confused chittering. Look, Riley said, her tone shifting to something more patient. Let me give you a practical example. Who here has studied the Battle of Kepler 438b? Several appendages, tentacles, and other anatomical communication devices were raised. Standard galactic textbook analysis says it was a perfect example of proper defensive warfare, right? The defending force established overlapping fields of fire, prepared fallback positions, and executed a textbook fighting withdrawal when their position became untenable. Nods of agreement rippled through the room. What the textbooks don't mention, Riley continued with a predatory smile, is that the defending force was human, and their textbook fighting withdrawal was actually a carefully orchestrated trap designed to lure the attacking force into a kill zone that violated about 17 different conventions on proper battlefield conduct. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that happens when an entire room full of people realizes they've been looking at something completely wrong. General Thexazoth found his voice first. That cannot be correct. The analysis clearly shows. The analysis shows what the human commander wanted it to show, Riley interrupted. See, the attackers were following standard galactic doctrine, which meant they were predictable. The human commander knew exactly how they'd respond to a proper defensive withdrawal, so he set up the whole thing to channel them into a position where they could be eliminated efficiently. But the casualties, protested the Mantis Thing. The human losses were significant. The human losses were acceptable, Riley corrected, with the kind of cold precision that made Derek remember why he was glad she was on his side. Total enemy force eliminated, strategic objective secured, acceptable losses sustained, mission successful. Acceptable losses, repeated General Thexazoth slowly. You speak of your own soldiers' lives as acceptable losses. Riley's expression shifted to something Derek recognized as dangerous. I speak of soldiers' lives as precious resources that should be spent wisely, not wasted on adherence to tactical doctrine that gets them killed for no purpose. Every human who died in that battle died completing an objective that saved thousands of other lives. That's not acceptable losses. That's successful command decision-making. The room fell silent again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. This was the silence of people grappling with concepts that challenged everything they'd been taught. Finally, one of the Veltar spoke up. Staff Sergeant, Mountain of Anger. Just Riley is fine, she said with a slight smile. Riley, if human military doctrine is so effective, why do galactic military academies not teach these methods? Riley looked around the room, taking in the collection of alien faces all focused on her with desperate attention. Because, she said finally, your civilizations have forgotten that the purpose of military force is to break things and kill people efficiently, not to provide a framework for honorable competition between professional warrior classes. Derek winced. That was probably going to end up in someone's diplomatic complaint, but Riley wasn't done. You've turned warfare into a game with rules and referees and points for style. The problem is, When you go up against someone who's playing to win instead of playing to look good doing it, you lose. Every time. A Zethrak student leaned forward, his warrior braids jangling. But surely there must be honor in combat. There's honor in victory, Riley said simply. There's honor in bringing your people home alive. There's honor in completing your mission and protecting what you're sworn to protect. Everything else is just posturing. She paused, looking thoughtful. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying humans don't value honor. We do. But our definition of honor is getting the job done, not getting the job done prettily. General Thexazoth was making that grinding sound again, but now it sounded less like nervous anxiety, and more like mental gears trying to shift into an entirely new configuration. Staff Sergeant Riley, he said slowly, would you be willing to provide a practical demonstration of these human methods? Derek felt his blood pressure spike. This was exactly the kind of question that led to incidents. Riley's grin was positively feral. What did you have in mind? 20 minutes later, Derek found himself standing in the Academy's main tactical simulation chamber, watching Riley explain to a room full of fascinated aliens why their standard simulation parameters were fundamentally flawed. First problem, she was saying, gesturing at the holographic display showing a standard urban warfare scenario. You've given both sides equal information. In real combat, information is never equal. Someone always knows more than someone else, and the side that leverages their information advantage usually wins. The simulation technician, a spidery creature with way too many eyes, made what Derek assumed were adjustment gestures. The display shifted, showing fog of war effects that made parts of the battlefield uncertain. Better, Riley acknowledged. Second problem. You've assumed both sides will follow the same tactical doctrine. In reality, asymmetric warfare is the norm, not the exception. More adjustments. The enemy force indicators shifted from standard military units to irregular groupings that didn't follow conventional organization patterns. Third problem, Riley continued, really getting into her element now. You've assumed that both sides will limit themselves to standard military equipment and tactics. Real warfare includes improvised weapons, unconventional force multiplication, and creative interpretation of available resources. Derek watched General Thexazoth's expression shift through several phases of what he was pretty sure was alien military cognitive dissonance. The poor bastard was trying to process concepts that violated everything he'd been taught about proper warfare. Staff Sergeant Riley, the general said carefully. Surely you cannot suggest that we allow simulation participants to cheat. Riley's laugh was the kind that made enemy commanders reconsider their career choices. General, with respect, if it's available on the battlefield, it's not cheating. It's resource utilization. She turned to address the room full of students, who were watching with the kind of rapt attention usually reserved for natural disasters and religious experiences. Human military philosophy is simple, she said. If it works, it's tactics. If it works consistently, it's doctrine. If it works consistently and the enemy can't counter it, it's strategy. Everything else is just academic theory. The simulation technician completed its adjustments and looked up with several of its eyes. Parameters, adjusted. Ready for demonstration? Perfect, Riley said, cracking her knuckles in a way that made everyone in the room slightly nervous. Who wants to volunteer to command the opposing force? The silence that followed was the kind of silence that happens when everyone in a room simultaneously realizes they're about to volunteer for their own educational humiliation. Finally, General Thexazoth stepped forward. I will command the opposing force. Standard galactic military doctrine, proper formation fighting, honor guards, and established battle lines. Excellent, Riley said with obvious satisfaction. I'll take the defending force. Human doctrine, which means I'll use whatever works. Derek found himself assigned to observer status, which he suspected was Academy speak for, someone needs to write the incident report when this goes inevitably wrong. The simulation initialized, and Derek watched the holographic display show two forces taking position in a simulated urban environment. General Thexazoth's force was textbook perfect. Organized formations, clear command structure, proper equipment loadouts, and advanced scouts establishing reconnaissance. Riley's force looked like a bar fight that had gotten organized. Her units were scattered throughout the urban environment with no apparent pattern. Their equipment loadouts were wildly inconsistent, and their command structure seemed to consist entirely of, Riley tells people what to do and they improvise accordingly. Begin simulation, announced the technician. General Thexazoth's force advanced with machine-like precision, clearing sectors systematically and maintaining proper formation discipline. It was textbook urban warfare, executed flawlessly according to every military manual Derek had ever seen. Riley's force seemed to have taken the concept of asymmetric warfare, and decided to see just how asymmetric they could get. Instead of engaging the advancing force directly, her units melted away before contact, falling back through the urban environment in patterns that made no tactical sense according to standard doctrine. But Derek, who'd seen human-urban warfare before, recognized what she was doing. "She's channeling them," he murmured to himself. "Channeling?" asked a Veltar student who'd overheard. "Watch the retreat patterns," Derek said, pointing at the display. "She's not running away randomly. She's forcing the General's force to advance along specific routes, into areas where she can control the engagement." On the display, General Thexazoth's perfectly organized formations were being guided through the urban environment like water flowing through carefully designed channels. Every time they encountered resistance, it came from unexpected angles before melting away again, drawing them deeper into the simulated city. "This is not proper tactical doctrine," General Thexazoth muttered, watching his forces advance through what should have been a successful urban clearing operation. "No," Riley agreed cheerfully from her command position. "It's effective tactical doctrine." That's when the first building exploded. The simulation chamber filled with excited chatter in 17 different languages as the holographic display showed one of the structures General Thexazoth's forces had cleared earlier suddenly erupting in a fireball that caught an entire formation in the blast radius. "Impossible!" the general exclaimed. "We cleared that building. There were no enemy forces present." "Nope," Riley confirmed. "There weren't. I left a few improvised explosive devices instead." That's sabotage." "That's force multiplication," Riley corrected. "Why use soldiers to guard a position when you can use booby traps? My people were better utilized elsewhere." Derek watched the simulation continue with the kind of fascination usually reserved for watching natural disasters unfold. Riley had turned the urban environment into a three-dimensional maze designed to frustrate, confuse, and ultimately destroy conventional military formations. Every standard tactic General Thexazoth's force employed was met with a response that violated every assumption underlying that tactic. When his forces tried to establish secure perimeters, they found that Riley's units had already infiltrated the areas they were trying to secure. When they attempted to control key terrain features, those features turned out to be rigged with more improvised explosives. When they tried to use their superior firepower to suppress resistance, they discovered that the resistance wasn't where they were shooting. "This is guerrilla warfare," one of the students observed. "This is effective warfare," Riley replied. "Guerrilla tactics, urban warfare, conventional assault, psychological operations. I'm using whatever works for the specific situation." The final phase of the simulation was what Derek would later describe as educational in the way that natural disasters are educational. General Thexazoth's remaining forces, having been systematically worn down by attrition and misdirection, found themselves herded into what they thought was the final defensive position of Riley's forces. Instead, they found themselves in a kill zone. The holographic display lit up like a fireworks show as every available piece of infrastructure in the immediate area suddenly revealed itself to be weaponized. Streetlights became automated gun positions. Manholes became improvised mortar tubes. Even the simulated storm drains started dispensing what the combat analysis system politely labeled as area denial munitions. The simulation ended with General Thexazoth's force suffering 94% casualties, while Riley's force had taken losses that the system calculated as minimal and acceptable. The silence in the simulation chamber was the kind of silence that happens when everyone present realizes they've just witnessed something that changes everything. General Thexazoth stared at the holographic display showing the tactical analysis of what had just happened. His chitinous plates shifted nervously as he processed casualty reports, resource utilization statistics, and tactical efficiency ratings that violated everything he'd been taught about how warfare was supposed to work. This cannot be correct," he said finally. "Computer," Riley called out, "verify simulation parameters and results." The simulation system's artificial intelligence responded in the kind of perfectly neutral tone that computers used when they were about to ruin someone's day. "Simulation parameters verified as accurate. All combat actions taken by defending force were within established possibility parameters for available resources and tactical constraints. Casualty projections verified as consistent with historical data for similar engagements." Derek watched General Thexazoth process this information with the kind of expression usually seen on people who've just been told that everything they believed about physics was wrong. But the tactics employed by the defending force were completely outside established military doctrine." "That's kind of the point," Riley said gently. "Established military doctrine assumes your enemy will follow the same doctrine. When they don't, your doctrine becomes a liability instead of an asset." She gestured at the holographic display, which was still showing the tactical analysis of the engagement. You fought perfectly according to everything you'd been taught. Your formations were textbook, your advance was methodical, your resource allocation was efficient. If you'd been fighting an enemy who followed the same tactical principles, you probably would have won. Instead, she continued, you fought an enemy who didn't care about your tactical principles. I used the fact that you were following standard doctrine against you. Every move you made was predictable because it was based on established patterns. I just had to figure out how to exploit those patterns. The room full of alien students was processing this with the kind of intense concentration that suggested mental paradigms shifting in real time. Finally, one of the Nefari spoke up, its translator managing to convey what Derek interpreted as thoughtful confusion. But if conventional military doctrine is so vulnerable to unconventional tactics, why do galactic military academies continue to teach it? Riley looked around the room, taking in the collection of faces and face analogs, all focused on her with desperate attention. Because, she said slowly, conventional military doctrine works great when everyone follows it. It's like a sport with agreed-upon rules. As long as everyone plays by the same rules, the game functions, and you can have clear winners and losers based on skill and preparation. She paused, choosing her words carefully. The problem is that warfare isn't a sport. It's not supposed to be fair, and there's no referee to enforce the rules. When you're fighting for your survival, really fighting, not just playing war games, you don't care about fighting fair. You care about winning. General Thexazoth had been listening with the kind of expression that suggested his worldview was undergoing major reconstruction. Finally, he spoke. Staff Sergeant Riley, he said carefully, are you suggesting that galactic military doctrine is fundamentally flawed? Riley considered this for a long moment. I'm suggesting that galactic military doctrine is fundamentally limited. It works fine when you're fighting other people who follow the same doctrine. But when you come up against someone who's willing to throw out the rulebook and focus purely on results, she gestured at the simulation display. Well, you saw what happens. Derek found himself stepping forward before he could stop himself. The problem, he said, surprised to hear his own voice, is that most galactic civilizations have turned warfare into a ritualized competition. It's become more about demonstrating martial virtue than about actually winning conflicts. Every alien in the room turned to look at him, and Derek realized he'd just volunteered himself for the same kind of educational demonstration Riley had been providing. Captain, Steel, Mountain? General Thexazoth's translator was clearly struggling with Derek's badge. Just Derek is fine, he said, shooting Riley a look that she returned with a grin that suggested she was enjoying watching him get dragged into this. And what I mean is that somewhere along the line, your civilization started treating warfare like a formal duel instead of like actual warfare. He gestured around the simulation chamber. Look at this facility. It's designed to teach students how to fight properly, according to established rules and conventions. But those rules and conventions only work if your enemy also follows them. And humans don't follow them, observed a Zithrak student. Humans follow one rule, Derek said. Win, everything else is negotiable. General Thexazoth was making that grinding sound again. But surely there must be some standards of civilized behavior in warfare. Oh, absolutely, Derek agreed. But those standards should be about minimizing unnecessary suffering and protecting non-combatants, not about making sure everyone fights prettily. He turned to address the room as a whole. Human military ethics are actually pretty strict. We have rules about treatment of prisoners, protection of civilians, proportional response, and legitimate military targets. What we don't have is rules that prevent us from using effective tactics just because they're unconventional. Riley nodded approvingly. The Geneva Conventions cover how you treat people. They don't cover how you fight. Derek could see the alien students processing this distinction with varying degrees of success. The concept that you could have ethical standards without tactical limitations seemed to be causing some serious cognitive strain. Perhaps, said General Thexazoth slowly, we should consider incorporating some of these human methods into our curriculum. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that happens when someone suggests something that's either brilliant or completely insane, and nobody's quite sure which. Riley's grin was back, and Derek felt that familiar sense of impending, well, probably not doom this time, but definitely significant change. I think, she said, that would be an excellent idea. 3 months later, Derek stood in the same lecture hall, watching Riley put a new group of students through what had officially become known as adaptive tactical methodology, and unofficially become known as how to fight like a human without getting court-martialed. The transformation had been remarkable, if not entirely smooth. The Academy's administration had initially been horrified by the implications of Riley's demonstration. But the subsequent performance improvements in their graduating classes had been impossible to ignore. Students who'd completed the new human influence training modules were showing tactical flexibility that had previously been unheard of in galactic military circles. Of course, there had been some adjustments required. "No, Cadet Vorthak," Riley was saying patiently to a young Zithrak whose warrior braids were trembling with barely contained enthusiasm. "When I said use available resources creatively, I did not mean challenge the enemy commander to single combat using improvised weapons made from cafeteria equipment." The Zithrak's translator conveyed what Derek had learned to recognize as disappointed warrior confusion. "But honor demands that you complete your mission and bring your people home alive," Riley interrupted with the kind of gentle firmness that had made her legendary among human drill instructors. "Everything else is just cultural programming." Derek watched the young alien process this with the kind of expression that suggested deeply held beliefs were being gently but firmly rearranged. It was a look he'd become familiar with over the past few months, as more and more galactic military officers were exposed to human tactical philosophy. The ripple effects had been significant. The Corvin military, still traumatized by their experiences with human, unconventional warfare, had been the first to request access to the new training materials. Their official diplomatic note had included the phrase, "urgent need to understand human tactical methodology for defensive purposes," which Derek translated as, "Please teach us how to fight these terrifying primates before they come up with something even worse." The Veltar Collective had approached the situation with their characteristic methodical precision, sending a team of military analysts to study human warfare with the kind of scientific rigor usually reserved for investigating natural phenomena. Their preliminary reports had included phrases like systematic exploitation of cognitive biases in enemy decision-making and weaponization of environmental factors previously considered tactically irrelevant. Even the proud Zithrak warrior culture had begun quietly incorporating human methods into their training, though they insisted on calling it expansion of traditional warrior techniques, rather than admitting they were learning from the young species. "The key point," Riley was explaining to her current class, "is that adaptive tactics aren't about abandoning structure entirely. They're about maintaining flexibility within your structure, so you can respond when the situation changes." She gestured to the holographic display, which showed a tactical scenario that would have been considered impossibly complex just a few months ago. "Your enemy will always try to do something you didn't expect. The question is whether you've trained your people to handle unexpected situations, or whether you've trained them to follow procedures that assume everything will go according to plan." An Afari student pulsed through several colors before speaking. "But how does one train for unexpected situations? By definition, they cannot be anticipated." Riley's grin was the expression of a teacher who'd just been asked exactly the right question. "That's the beautiful part. You don't train for specific unexpected situations. You train people to think." Derek found himself nodding along. This was the part of human military philosophy that seemed to cause the most confusion among their galactic colleagues. The idea that individual initiative and creative problem-solving were more valuable than perfect adherence to established procedures. "Human military training," Riley continued, "is designed around scenarios that force soldiers to make decisions without complete information, adapt to changing conditions, and improvise solutions using whatever resources are available. We call it training for chaos, and it's probably the most important thing we teach." "But surely," protested a crystalline Veltar, "such training would result in lack of unit cohesion and breakdown of command authority?" "Actually, no," Derek said, stepping forward to join the discussion. "It results in stronger unit cohesion, because everyone understands their role in accomplishing the mission rather than just following specific orders." He activated the holographic display to show a different tactical scenario. "Watch what happens when a human unit loses communication with command authority during an operation." The simulation showed a human squad moving through hostile territory when their communications equipment failed, cutting them off from higher command. Instead of freezing in place or falling back to re-establish contact, the squad continued their mission, adapting their tactics based on the changing situation and their understanding of the overall objective. "Each soldier understands not just what they're supposed to do, but why they're supposed to do it," Derek explained. "When the situation changes, they can modify their actions while still working toward the same goal." The alien students watched the simulation with the kind of fascination that suggested mental paradigms shifting in real time. Derek had gotten used to that look over the past few months. This is command decentralization taken to its logical extreme," observed General Thexazoth, who had become something of a regular attendee at these sessions. The transformation in the old warrior had been remarkable. From rigid adherent to traditional doctrine to eager student of human tactical innovation. Not decentralization, Riley corrected. Distribution. Everyone in the unit shares responsibility for mission success, which means everyone needs to understand how to think tactically. She turned to address the class as a whole. That's the real difference between human military doctrine and traditional galactic doctrine. You train specialists to perform specific functions within a rigid structure. We train generalists to perform whatever function the situation requires. Derek watched the students process this concept with varying degrees of success. The idea that a single soldier might need to be capable of infantry combat, technical operation, tactical planning, and leadership depending on circumstances was apparently quite radical in galactic military circles. Of course, Riley added with a grin that Derek had learned to fear. There are some practical exercises that can help illustrate these principles. Which was how, 2 hours later, Derek found himself standing in the Academy's expanded simulation complex, watching an entire class of alien military students attempt to complete what Riley had cheerfully described as a basic human training exercise. The scenario was deceptively simple. A mixed unit of different species had to secure and hold a defensive position against superior enemy forces, using only the equipment and resources available in the immediate area. Standard galactic doctrine would have called for establishing overlapping fields of fire, preparing fallback positions, and conducting an orderly fighting withdrawal when the position became untenable. Riley had told them to get creative. The results had been educational. The Velatar contingent had immediately begun conducting a systematic analysis of available resources, cataloging everything from standard military equipment to the molecular composition of the local soil. Their methodical approach was impressive, but Derek could see they were struggling with the concept of creative improvisation. The Zithrak warriors had thrown themselves into the exercise with typical enthusiasm, but kept trying to modify the scenario parameters to allow for individual combat challenges. The idea of using terrain and available materials as force multipliers seemed to conflict with their cultural preference for direct confrontation. The Nefari were having the most success, their natural flexibility allowing them to adapt to the unconventional requirements of the exercise. Derek watched one of them figure out how to use the simulation chamber's environmental controls to create artificial weather patterns that would provide concealment and misdirection. Interesting approaches, Riley commented, watching the exercise unfold on the tactical display. But they're still thinking like specialists instead of like soldiers. How so? Asked General Thexazoth, who was observing the exercise with the kind of intense focus usually reserved for religious experiences. Watch the Veltar team, Riley said, pointing at the display. They're conducting perfect resource analysis, but they're not actually using the resources they're cataloging. Analysis paralysis. They're so focused on understanding everything perfectly that they're not acting on what they already know. Derek nodded, seeing what she meant. And the Zithrak are trying to modify the problem to fit their preferred solution, instead of modifying their solution to fit the problem. Exactly. The Nefari are doing better because they're naturally adaptable, but they're still approaching it as individuals rather than as a coordinated unit. Riley activated her communication link to the simulation. Attention all participants. Time acceleration is now active. Enemy forces will reach your position in 15 minutes. Recommend you stop planning and start acting. The response was immediate and chaotic. The various alien students began scrambling to implement hastily revised plans. But Derek could see they were still trying to apply traditional tactical doctrine to a fundamentally non-traditional situation. They're missing the point, he murmured to Riley. Give them time, she replied. This is their first exposure to human-style tactical thinking. They've spent their entire careers being taught that there's a right way and a wrong way to do everything. We're asking them to throw that out and focus on what works. On the display, the mixed alien unit was attempting to establish something resembling a conventional defensive position, using decidedly unconventional methods. The Veltar had finally started implementing some of their resource analysis, turning structural support beams into improvised barriers and jury-rigging sensor equipment to provide early warning. The Zithrak had discovered that their cultural emphasis on personal combat prowess actually translated quite well to close-quarters fighting in improvised defensive positions. The Nefari were using their natural camouflage abilities to create the kind of overlapping ambush positions that would have made human special forces proud. Better, Riley acknowledged. They're starting to think outside their doctrinal boxes. The simulation's enemy forces reached engagement range, and Derek watched the tactical display light up with combat indicators. What followed was unlike any military engagement he'd seen in galactic warfare simulations. Instead of the formal, structured combat that characterized traditional galactic military doctrine, the alien students had created something that resembled human asymmetric warfare. Their defensive position wasn't a position at all. It was a three-dimensional puzzle designed to confuse, misdirect, and ultimately destroy attacking forces through attrition and misdirection. The Velatar contingent had weaponized the environment itself, turning the simulation chamber's terrain features into active defensive systems. The Zithrak were using their warrior training in ways their ancestors had probably never imagined, turning individual combat skills into coordinated small-unit tactics. The Nefari had essentially disappeared, turning the entire engagement area into a maze of hidden threats and false positions. Now that, Derek said with admiration, is starting to look like effective warfare. The simulation concluded with the attacking force suffering casualties that the system rated as catastrophic, while the defending force maintained what human military analysts would consider acceptable loss ratios. More importantly, the defending force had completed their mission objective while adapting to changing tactical conditions in real time. The silence in the observation area was the kind of silence that happens when everyone present realizes they've just witnessed something significant. The tactical efficiency ratings, General Thexazoth said slowly, staring at the post-simulation analysis, are unlike anything in galactic military history. The tactical efficiency ratings, Riley corrected gently, are consistent with human military engagements, which suggests that galactic military history might need some revision. Derek watched the alien students in the simulation chamber as they processed what had just happened. They'd successfully completed an exercise that required them to abandon everything they'd been taught about proper military procedure, and they'd not only survived but excelled. "I think," he said quietly, "we might have just started a revolution." Riley's grin was the expression of someone who'd just accomplished exactly what she'd set out to do. "I think you might be right." The aftermath of what military historians would later call the interspecies tactical revolution was both more and less dramatic than Derek had expected. More dramatic because the implications rippled through galactic military establishments with the kind of systematic thoroughness that suggested paradigms shifting on a civilization-wide scale. Less dramatic because most of the changes happened through quiet policy modifications and curriculum updates, rather than dramatic announcements and public debates. The Korvan Defense Forces were the first to formally adopt human-influenced tactical doctrine, officially describing it as Enhanced Adaptive Response Protocols, while unofficially referring to it as learning to fight like those terrifying apes before they invent something worse. Their first engagement using the new methods resulted in a victory so decisive that enemy forces requested immediate ceasefire negotiations rather than risk continued contact. The Velatar Collective approached the situation with characteristic scientific rigor, conducting extensive studies on human tactical methodology before implementing what they called dynamic resource optimization protocols. Their research papers on the subject became required reading at military academies across 3 star systems, and included footnotes that Derek was pretty sure were the Veltar equivalent of academic excitement. Even the proud Zithrak warrior culture began quietly incorporating human methods, though they insisted on maintaining traditional terminology. Enhanced warrior flexibility training and expanded combat honor protocols were apparently more palatable than admitting they were learning from the young species, but the practical results were identical. The most significant change, however, was in the academy itself. The new curriculum, General Thexazoth was explaining to a gathering of military attachés from 17 different species, represents a fundamental evolution in military education philosophy. Derek stood at the back of the conference room, watching alien military officers process information that would have been considered radical heresy just 6 months earlier. Riley was beside him, wearing the kind of satisfied expression that suggested she was enjoying watching the universe catch up to human tactical thinking. "Instead of training specialists in specific tactical procedures," the general continued, "we now focus on developing adaptive thinking and creative problem-solving abilities. Students learn not just how to execute established tactics, but how to develop new tactics when established methods prove insufficient." A Korvan attaché raised what Derek assumed was a hand. "General, are you suggesting that formal military doctrine should be abandoned?" "I am suggesting," General Thexazoth replied with the patience of someone who'd had this conversation several dozen times, "that formal military doctrine should be treated as a starting point rather than an end point, a foundation for tactical thinking rather than a substitute for it." Derek found himself nodding along. The transformation in the old warrior had been remarkable, from rigid adherent to traditional methods to enthusiastic advocate for tactical innovation. It had taken several months and quite a few simulation exercises, but General Thexazoth had eventually embraced the human approach to warfare with the fervor of a convert. The practical results, the general continued, activating a holographic display showing tactical analysis data, speak for themselves. Academy graduates who have completed the enhanced curriculum demonstrate tactical flexibility and battlefield effectiveness that exceed traditional metrics by significant margins. The data was impressive, even by human standards. Students who'd been exposed to adaptive tactical methodology were showing performance improvements that violated several previously established assumptions about military training effectiveness. Of course, Riley murmured to Derek. The real test will come when these graduates start encountering actual combat situations. Derek nodded. Simulation exercises were one thing, but real warfare had a way of revealing flaws in training that no simulation could anticipate. Still, the early indicators were promising. Staff Sergeant Riley called out a Nefari attaché. Could you explain how human tactical doctrine maintains unit cohesion while encouraging individual initiative? Riley stepped forward with the kind of confidence that came from months of explaining human military philosophy to confused aliens. The key is shared understanding of objectives rather than shared procedures. When everyone in a unit understands not just what they're supposed to accomplish, but why they're supposed to accomplish it, they can adapt their methods while maintaining focus on the mission. She activated the display to show a tactical scenario. Traditional doctrine says, do this specific thing in this specific way. Human doctrine says, accomplish this objective using whatever methods are most effective given current conditions. Derek watched the alien attachés process this distinction with varying degrees of success. The concept that unity of purpose could be more important than unity of method was apparently still revolutionary in galactic military circles. But surely, protested a Zithrak representative, such flexibility must result in chaos and confusion during combat operations. Actually, Derek said, stepping forward to join the discussion, it results in the opposite. When soldiers understand their role in the overall mission, they can coordinate effectively even when communication breaks down or command structure is disrupted. He gestured to the display. Human military units are designed to function as distributed networks rather than hierarchical structures. Remove any single node, including command authority, and the network adapts and continues functioning. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that happened when people were grappling with concepts that challenged fundamental assumptions about military organization. Finally, General Thexazoth spoke. Perhaps a practical demonstration would be helpful. Riley's grin was back, and Derek felt that familiar sense of impending educational chaos. I think that's an excellent idea, she said. 2 hours later, Derek found himself in the Academy's main simulation complex, watching 17 different species attempt to coordinate a complex military operation using pure human tactical doctrine. The scenario was intentionally challenging. A joint task force had to secure multiple objectives across a large operational area while dealing with communication disruptions, equipment failures, and changing enemy tactics. Traditional galactic military doctrine would have required extensive planning, rigid command hierarchies, and detailed coordination protocols. Riley had told them to figure it out as you go. The results were illuminating. The mixed species units had started the exercise by attempting to establish traditional command structures and communication protocols. When the simulation began introducing the inevitable complications, lost communications, equipment failures, unexpected enemy responses, those traditional structures had started breaking down exactly as human tactical doctrine predicted they would. But then something interesting happened. Instead of freezing in place or falling back to re-establish proper procedures, the alien participants began adapting. The Veltar used their analytical abilities to develop real-time tactical assessments and shared them with other units through improvised communication methods. The Zithrak applied their individual combat skills to small unit operations that supported the overall mission even when they couldn't coordinate directly with other forces. The Nefari used their natural adaptability to fill gaps in unit organization and maintain mission continuity when formal structures failed. They're learning, Derek murmured, watching the tactical display show coordination patterns that looked increasingly like human military operations. They're thinking, Riley corrected with obvious satisfaction. They've stopped trying to follow procedures and started trying to solve problems. On the display, the Joint Task Force was accomplishing their objectives through methods that would have horrified traditional galactic military instructors. Units were self-organizing based on immediate tactical requirements rather than formal hierarchy. Resources were being redistributed dynamically based on changing conditions rather than predetermined allocation. Most importantly, individual initiative was being exercised within the framework of shared mission understanding, rather than being suppressed in favor of procedural compliance. The coordination efficiency ratings, General Thexazoth observed, studying the real-time analysis data, are approaching theoretical maximums. The coordination efficiency ratings, Derek replied, are approaching human normal. The simulation concluded with the Joint Task Force successfully completing all primary objectives and most secondary objectives, while maintaining acceptable casualty ratios and resource utilization efficiency. More importantly, they'd done it while adapting to conditions that would have rendered traditional galactic tactical doctrine completely ineffective. The debriefing session that followed was unlike anything Derek had seen in galactic military education. Instead of analyzing what had gone right or wrong according to established doctrine, the participants were discussing what they'd learned about adaptive problem-solving and distributed decision-making. The key insight, a Veltar officer was explaining, was recognizing that tactical coordination could be maintained through shared understanding of objectives rather than centralized command authority. The cultural barrier, added a Zithrek warrior, was overcoming the assumption that individual initiative necessarily undermines unit cohesion. Derek found himself impressed, despite his better judgment. These alien military officers were grasping concepts that some human military schools still struggled with. Staff Sergeant Riley asked a Nefari participant, "How does human military training prepare soldiers for this kind of distributed decision-making?" Riley considered the question for a moment. "We start with the assumption that everything will go wrong," she said finally. "Every training exercise is designed around Murphy's Law. If something can go wrong, it will go wrong at the worst possible moment." She gestured around the simulation chamber. "We don't train people to execute perfect plans. We train them to accomplish missions when the plans fall apart, the equipment fails, and the enemy does something completely unexpected." "But how does one train for complete unpredictability?" pressed the Nefari. "You don't train for specific unpredictable events," Derek explained. "You train people to think systematically about problem-solving under pressure. You give them tools for analyzing situations, making decisions with incomplete information, and adapting to changing conditions." Riley nodded. "Human military training is essentially applied philosophy. We teach people how to think about warfare, not just how to perform specific military tasks." The alien participants absorbed this with the kind of intense concentration that suggested paradigms shifting in real time. Derek was beginning to recognize that look as the expression of military officers realizing that everything they'd learned about warfare needed to be reconsidered. "Perhaps," General Thexazoth said slowly, "it is time to consider a more comprehensive revision of galactic military doctrine." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that happens when someone suggests something that will change everything. Riley's grin was the expression of someone who'd just accomplished exactly what she'd set out to do from the very beginning. "I think," she said, "that would be an excellent idea." 6 months later. Derek stood in the Academy's main lecture hall, but this time he wasn't observing. This time he was the one behind the podium, looking out at a room full of alien faces and face analogs, representing the military establishments of 43 different galactic civilizations. "The transformation of galactic military doctrine," he was saying, "represents more than just tactical innovation. It represents a fundamental shift in how we think about conflict resolution, resource utilization, and interspecies cooperation." In the audience, he could see General Thexazoth nodding approvingly. The old warrior had become something of a celebrity in galactic military circles, his transformation from traditional doctrine adherent to adaptive tactical advocate serving as an inspiration to military officers across the galaxy. Riley sat in the front row, wearing the kind of satisfied expression that suggested she was enjoying watching the universe finally catch up to human thinking. Her official title was now Director of Adaptive Tactical Education, though everyone still called her Staff Sergeant Riley out of habit and respect. "The key insight," Derek continued, "is that effective military organization is not about perfect adherence to established procedures. It's about developing the ability to adapt those procedures when circumstances require it." He activated the holographic display to show comparative analysis data that would have been impossible to imagine a year earlier. Military units trained in adaptive tactical methodology demonstrate superior performance across all measured categories: mission completion rates, casualty minimization, resource efficiency, and long-term strategic effectiveness. A Corvin representative raised what Derek had learned was a question gesture. "Captain Steele, How do we maintain military discipline while encouraging individual initiative? Derek smiled, remembering when that same question had seemed impossibly complex. Military discipline isn't about suppressing individual thinking. It's about channeling individual thinking toward collective objectives. When every soldier understands not just their orders, but the purpose behind those orders, discipline becomes self-reinforcing rather than externally imposed. The questions that followed covered everything from training methodology to equipment design to strategic planning philosophy. Derek found himself discussing concepts that had been considered radical just months earlier, as if they were established military science. Because, he realized, they were becoming established military science. The human approach to warfare was being adopted, adapted, and integrated into galactic military culture with the kind of systematic thoroughness that suggested permanent change rather than temporary fashion. After the formal session ended, Derek found himself surrounded by alien military officers eager to discuss specific implementation details. The enthusiasm was remarkable. These weren't conquered enemies being forced to adopt human methods, but willing students eager to learn more effective ways of accomplishing their missions. "Captain?" General Thexazoth approached with what Derek had learned to recognize as his pleased commanding officer expression. "The preliminary reports from recent engagements are quite encouraging." Derek nodded. The real-world test results had been impressive. Military units trained in adaptive tactical methodology were showing performance improvements that validated everything the simulations had predicted. More importantly, they were showing the kind of tactical creativity that suggested genuine understanding, rather than rote application of new procedures. "The Corvan Defense Forces," the general continued, "report successful resolution of 3 border conflicts using methods that would have been considered impossible under traditional doctrine. The Velatar Collective has requested expansion of their training program to include civilian emergency response applications. Even the Zithrak warrior clans are incorporating adaptive tactics into their traditional combat training." Derek found himself impressed despite having expected these results. The speed and thoroughness of the adoption had exceeded even his optimistic projections. "Of course," he said, "the real test will come when we encounter a truly novel tactical challenge. Something none of us have seen before." Riley joined them, having extracted herself from her own crowd of eager questioners. "That's the beautiful part," she said with obvious satisfaction. "We're not training people to handle specific challenges. We're training them to handle novelty itself." Derek nodded, understanding what she meant. The human approach to military training wasn't about preparing for known threats. It was about developing the cognitive flexibility to handle unknown threats effectively. "Besides," Riley added with the kind of grin that had made her legendary, "if there's one thing humans are good at, it's coming up with new ways to break things and kill people efficiently. I'm sure we'll provide plenty of novel tactical challenges for everyone to practice on." General Thexazoth's chitinous plates shifted and what Derek had learned was alien laughter. "Staff Sergeant Riley, I believe the galaxy is quite grateful for your species' willingness to share your innovations, rather than simply demonstrate them." Derek found himself laughing along with them. It was true. The galaxy had been remarkably fortunate that humanity's first contact with galactic civilization had resulted in educational cooperation rather than continued warfare. The alternative didn't bear thinking about. "Well," he said, looking around at the collection of alien military officers still engaged in animated discussions about tactical methodology, "I think we can safely say that galactic military doctrine will never be the same." Riley's grin was the expression of someone who'd just accomplished something she'd dreamed about for years. "I think we can safely say that the galaxy will never be the same." Derek nodded, watching alien warriors debate the merits of improvised tactics and adaptive resource utilization with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for discussing technological breakthroughs or artistic achievements. Humanity had joined the galactic community through warfare, but they were transforming it through education. It wasn't the outcome anyone had expected, but it was probably the outcome everyone needed. After all, in a universe full of unknown threats and unexpected challenges, the ability to adapt and innovate wasn't just useful. It was essential for survival. And if there was one thing humans were genuinely excellent at, it was surviving things that should have killed them by being too stubborn to die and too creative to accept defeat. The galaxy, Derek reflected, was about to become a much more interesting place. Epilogue. 1 year later. The emergency session of the Galactic Defense Council was called to address what the official diplomatic language described as an unprecedented extragalactic threat requiring immediate coordinated response. The unofficial language, used in private communications between military commanders, was considerably more colorful and significantly less optimistic. The threat was simple to describe and impossible to ignore. An invasion fleet of unknown origin and composition, using technology and tactics that didn't match any known galactic civilization, approaching the Outer Rim systems with apparent hostile intent. A year earlier, such a threat would have resulted in panic, confusion, and the kind of bureaucratic paralysis that characterized galactic military response to novel situations. Military commanders would have spent weeks arguing about proper protocols, resource allocation, and command authority, while the threat grew closer and more dangerous. Instead, the response was swift, coordinated, and creative. Derek stood in the main tactical center of the Joint Defense Coordination Facility, watching dozens of different species work together with the kind of seamless efficiency that would have been impossible under traditional galactic military doctrine. Veltar analysts were providing real-time threat assessment while Zthruk warriors planned assault operations, and Nefari scouts gathered intelligence using methods that violated several previous assumptions about proper reconnaissance protocol. "The enemy fleet configuration," reported a Corvan intelligence officer, "does not match any known tactical doctrine. Their approach patterns suggest either complete unfamiliarity with galactic military conventions or deliberate disregard for established engagement protocols." Derek found himself smiling. A year ago, that report would have caused confusion and alarm. Now it sounded like an opportunity. "Recommendations?" asked General Thexazoth, who had been appointed overall tactical coordinator for the defense effort. "We use their unfamiliarity against them," Riley replied from her position at the central tactical display. "They're expecting us to respond according to whatever military doctrine they're familiar with. Instead, we respond according to human doctrine." "Which means?" prompted a Veltar coordinator. "Which means we do whatever works," Derek said, stepping forward to join the discussion. "They've planned for conventional galactic military response. Formal battle lines, established engagement protocols, predictable tactical patterns. We give them something completely different." The tactical display activated, showing the defense plan that had been developed using pure adaptive methodology. Instead of the traditional galactic approach of meeting the invasion fleet in formal battle, the combined defense forces would implement a strategy that looked like controlled chaos, but was actually carefully orchestrated asymmetric warfare on an interstellar scale. "The first phase," Riley explained, "involves apparent retreat and disorganization designed to draw the enemy fleet into positions where we can control the engagement parameters. The second phase," continued Derek, "uses distributed strike forces to attack supply lines, communication nodes, and command infrastructure while avoiding direct confrontation with primary battle groups. The third phase," General Thexazoth added with obvious satisfaction, "involves coordinated assault on weakened enemy positions, using tactics that exploit their unfamiliarity with adaptive galactic military doctrine." Derek watched the alien commanders process the plan with expressions that ranged from excitement to barely controlled terror. It was a strategy that would have been impossible to implement under traditional galactic military organization, but which had become feasible thanks to a year of adaptive tactical training. "Estimated probability of success?" asked a Nefari representative. "Unknown," Riley replied cheerfully. "But estimated probability of success using traditional methods is approximately 0, so we're already ahead." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that happens when everyone present realizes they're about to participate in something that will either be remembered as brilliant innovation or catastrophic failure. "Well then," General Thexazoth said finally, his chitinous plates shifting with what Derek had learned was determined resignation, "I suppose we shall discover whether human tactical methodology is as effective against unknown threats as it has proven against known ones." Derek found himself nodding. It was, he reflected, exactly the kind of test that human military doctrine was designed for. An unknown enemy using unfamiliar tactics threatening everything they were sworn to protect. "General," he said with the kind of confidence that came from a lifetime of dealing with impossible situations, "I think you're about to find out why humans have such a reputation for winning fights we shouldn't be able to win." Riley's grin was the expression of someone who was about to demonstrate exactly why the galaxy had been so fortunate that humanity had chosen cooperation over conquest. "Ladies, gentlemen, and beings of indeterminate gender classification," she announced to the room full of alien military commanders, "let me show you what human warfare looks like when we're actually trying." The battle for the galaxy was about to begin, and for the first time in galactic military history, everyone involved was looking forward to finding out what would happen when established doctrine met genuine innovation. It was, Derek thought, going to be educational for everyone involved, especially the invaders. The end.